There's a particular kind of silence that falls over a dinner table when someone has just been humiliated and everyone else decides the mashed potatoes are suddenly very interesting. I know that silence well. I sat inside it for years before I understood what it was actually protecting. That Thanksgiving, my son-in-law Derek set down his wine glass, looked around the table like he was about to deliver a toast, and said, "Let's be honest, Walter's pension check probably covers dog food and gas. That's about it." A couple of people laughed the way people laugh when they're relieved it isn't aimed at them. My daughter Beth stared at her plate. My granddaughter Lily, 7 years old, looked straight at me with her fork halfway to her mouth and asked the question that would end up cracking the whole evening open. "Grandpa, are we supposed to feel sorry for you?" I didn't answer right away. I picked up my coffee cup, took a slow sip, and set it back down exactly where it had been. 41 years driving and repairing city buses teaches you something useful. You don't fix a stalled engine by revving it harder. You find out what's actually broken first. What none of them knew, not Derek, not even my own daughter, was that 3 weeks earlier, an attorney named Patricia Alvarez had already left a voicemail on my phone that would change how every single person at that table looked at me. I just hadn't told anyone yet. Some things you let sit until they're ready to be understood, not just heard. 6 months before that Thanksgiving, my life looked exactly the way Derek assumed it did. Small. Quiet. Unimpressive from a distance. I'm Walter Higgins. I was 71 that year, living alone in a 2-bedroom house on Larchmere Street in Worcester, Massachusetts. The same house my late wife Dolores and I bought in 1979 for $18,000, back when that number didn't sound like a typo. Dolores passed 4 years earlier from a stroke, quick and merciless, the kind of death that doesn't give you time to say the last thing you meant to say. I kept her reading glasses on the nightstand out of habit more than sentiment. I'd spent 38 years as a mechanic for the Worcester Regional Transit Authority, mostly on diesel engines and brake systems. The last 9 of those years training younger techs who called me Higgs behind my back like it was an inside joke I wasn't supposed to know about. I didn't mind. I liked being underestimated. It meant nobody watched too closely what I did with my time or my money. My days had a shape to them. Up at 6. Coffee, black, in the same chipped mug Dolores bought at a yard sale in 1991. A walk with my dog, a stubborn old beagle named Scout, down to the corner and back, sometimes further if my knees agreed to it. Tuesdays and Thursdays I played chess at the Worcester Senior Center with a retired postal worker named Manny Ferreira, who beat me exactly as often as I beat him, which we both considered a fair and honorable arrangement. I kept a small vegetable garden in the backyard, tomatoes mostly, a stubborn patch of zucchini that never knew when to quit. Wednesday evenings I did my grocery shopping at the same Stop and Shop on Chandler Street, where a cashier named Renata had known me long enough to ask about Scout by name before she asked about anything else. It was a small life. I want to be clear about that. I'm not going to pretend it was secretly glamorous. It was just mine, and it was steady, and I liked it. I should say, too, that I never felt poor, even though I understood exactly how my life looked from the outside. My pension from the Transit Authority came to just under $2,200 a month, supplemented by Social Security, and after the mortgage was long paid off and the bills were handled, there was enough left for the garden supplies, the senior center dues, and a standing Friday habit of buying Scout a rawhide bone from the pet store 2 doors down from Renata's register. I didn't need more than that. I want that understood clearly, because what came later was never about needing to prove I had money. It was about being seen accurately by people who'd decided, without ever checking, that they already knew the whole of me. Beth, my daughter, was 39, married to Derek Cole for 11 years. Derek worked as a wealth advisor for a regional investment firm downtown, the kind of job that came with a nice car lease and a habit of talking about portfolios the way other men talk about sports scores. He wasn't cruel by nature, I don't think. He was anxious about money in the specific, brutal way that people get when they've decided their worth is measured in account balances. I understood that better than he ever guessed. I just handled it differently. The trouble was, Derek had decided somewhere along the way that my life was a cautionary tale. And he wasn't shy about saying so, a little more each time we were all in a room together. The first time it really landed was at Easter, about a year and a half before that Thanksgiving. I'd driven over in my 2004 Buick, the paint gone chalky on the hood, and Derek met me in the driveway with a grin that had an edge to it. "Still driving the Buick? Huh, Walter? At some point you've got to treat yourself." He said it lightly, like a joke among friends. But there was a measuring look underneath it, the kind that sizes up a man and quietly files him under. Not worth taking seriously. I told him the Buick ran fine and cost me nothing, which was true. He laughed like I'd made a joke instead of a statement of fact. I let it go. Dolores used to say some battles aren't worth the breath it takes to fight them, and I'd carried that with me since she died, like it was one of the last things she'd handed me. The second time was worse, though it wore a friendlier disguise. It was Beth's birthday dinner, 8 months later, at a restaurant Derek had picked because he liked the wine list. Somewhere between the appetizers and the entrees, the conversation drifted to investments. Derek talking about a client whose portfolio had outperformed the index that quarter, using the kind of vocabulary that seemed designed less to inform and more to remind everyone at the table who understood money and who didn't. At one point he turned to me, not unkindly, and said, "You probably just keep everything in a savings account, right, Walter? That's all right. Simple man, simple approach." He smiled when he said it. Beth smiled too, a tight, apologetic smile, the kind that says I love you, but I'm not going to say anything right now. I nodded and said something about how a savings account never kept me up at night, which got a small laugh, and the conversation moved on without me. I remember driving home that night with the window cracked, cold October air coming in, thinking about how easy it is for people to build a whole story about you out of what you don't say. Between the birthday dinner and the graduation, there was a smaller moment that never would have made it into a story like this one if I hadn't kept turning it over in my mind for months afterward. It was a Sunday in early summer, and Beth had invited me over for a cookout. Nothing formal, just family in the backyard. Derek was manning the grill, and at some point he mentioned that he and Beth were thinking about refinancing their mortgage to free up cash for a kitchen renovation. I asked, out of ordinary curiosity, what rate they were looking at, and he laughed. Not meanly, but in that particular way people laugh when they've decided a question doesn't deserve a real answer, and said, "Don't worry about the math, Walter. It's a little more complicated than balancing a checkbook." Beth didn't hear it. Nobody else did either. It wasn't the kind of comment you'd repeat to anyone, because on its own it sounded like nothing. But I remember standing there by the cooler with a paper plate in my hand, feeling the small, specific sting of being dismissed by someone 20 years younger than me who assumed, without ever checking, that he simply knew more about money than I did. I said nothing. I ate my hamburger. I drove home that evening thinking about how many of these moments don't survive being spoken aloud to anyone else, and how that's exactly what lets them keep happening. The third time came at Lily's kindergarten graduation, of all places. It should have been a small, sweet thing. 36-year-olds in paper caps singing off-key. Derek was handing out programs near the folding chairs when he pointed me toward a row near the back, behind the Coles extended family. "We're keeping the front for people who are flying in," he said, not looking at me directly. "You don't mind, right? You're local." I didn't mind the seat. Seats don't insult anybody. It was the way he said local like it was a smaller category of person, a word doing quiet work it shouldn't have had to do. I sat in the back row and watched my granddaughter's paper cap slide sideways while she sang, and it was, genuinely, one of the best afternoons of that whole year. I want that on the record. The moments themselves were rarely the problem. It was what came after them, in the small comments, that stacked up like unpaid bills. The fourth time was Thanksgiving, the one I already told you about. But there was more to it than the pension line, and I should walk you through the rest, because the comment about my dog food budget wasn't actually the sharpest thing said that night. After the laughter died down and everyone went back to eating, Derek kept going, the way people do when a small laugh convinces them they've found a good bit. "I'm serious, though," he said, gesturing with his fork toward me, but talking to the table. "At some point, don't you think Walter should look at, I don't know, assisted living? Something more manageable. That house has to be a lot for someone on a fixed income." Beth said, "Derek. Just his name, low, a warning." "I'm not being mean," he said. "I'm being practical." Somebody's got to say it. "Say what exactly?" I asked. My voice was even. I wasn't reaching for a fight. I genuinely wanted him to finish the sentence out loud, in front of everyone, instead of letting it hang there half said. "That you're stretched thin," Derek said. "That a house like that, On a pension, at your age, it's a lot to carry alone. I'm saying it because I care, not to be cruel. You might be surprised what I can carry, I said. He laughed, short and a little too quick. Sure, Walter. Sure. Beth's mother, my former sister-in-law, Carol, who'd remained close to the family even after her own divorce from my late brother, cleared her throat and said, Derek, that's enough. Let's eat. Which was as close as anyone else at the table came to intervening. Nobody else said a word. I didn't need them to. I'd made peace, somewhere in my late 60s, with the fact that not every room is going to defend you, and that this doesn't actually change what's true. That was the sharper moment. Not the joke about dog food, the suggestion, delivered at a table full of family, that I was a problem to be managed. A liability line item. I felt something tighten in my chest, not anger exactly, more like the particular ache of being seen as smaller than you are by people who are supposed to know better. And then Lily asked her question. Grandpa, are we supposed to feel sorry for you? 7 years old, and she'd absorbed enough of the room's undertone to ask it plainly, the way children do when they haven't yet learned to dress a question up in politeness. Nobody laughed at that one. It just sat there. I looked at her and said, No, sweetheart. Nobody needs to feel sorry for anybody at this table. Then I finished my coffee, thanked Beth for the meal, and told everyone I had an early morning. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't correct Derek in front of the family, didn't list my accomplishments like a defense attorney, didn't slam a door. I got my coat, hugged Lily a little longer than usual, and drove home in the Buick with the heater rattling the way it always did in cold weather. Derek, for his part, had a much louder night than I did. Beth told me later that after I left, he spent 20 minutes defending himself to her, insisting he'd only been honest, his voice climbing until her mother, my ex-sister-in-law, technically, long story, asked him to lower it in front of the kids. He needed everyone to agree he hadn't done anything wrong. I didn't need anyone to agree with me about anything. That's a difference worth sitting with. I want to explain something about that drive home, because I think it's the part of this story people misunderstand the most. Restraint isn't the same as swallowing it. I wasn't holding my tongue because I was weak or scared or because I secretly agreed with him. I was holding my tongue because I already knew something Derek didn't, and I understood that the moment to use that knowledge hadn't arrived yet. There's a kind of strength that doesn't announce itself in the room where it's being tested. It waits for the room where it'll actually matter. I'd learned that patience from 38 years of diagnosing engines. You don't yell at a stalled bus. You get underneath it, quietly, and you find out what's really going on. People sometimes confuse a quiet response with an absent one, as if the only proof you've been wronged is how loudly you react to it. I've never believed that. A raised voice tells the room how a person feels in that instant. It doesn't tell you anything about what they'll actually do next, and it rarely changes the mind of the person being confronted. It usually just gives them something to point at afterward, some excuse to say the reaction was disproportionate to the offense. I wasn't interested in handing Derek that excuse. I wanted whatever came next to rest entirely on the facts, with nothing for him to blame on my tone. That's not passivity. That's strategy, dressed up as patience, learned the same slow way I learned everything else worth knowing. What was really going on, underneath my life, went back to 1988. That was the year Dolores and I sat at our kitchen table with a legal pad and decided that instead of spending my overtime pay from a stretch of Saturday shifts, we'd put $100 a month into an investment account at a small brokerage on Main Street. A friend from the garage, a fellow named Carl Pruitt, had gotten me interested in a company that made industrial control components, unglamorous stuff, valves and sensors, after his brother-in-law worked there as an engineer. It wasn't a hot tip. It wasn't even exciting. It was just a company that made things people needed and kept making them, year after year, without much fanfare. We kept it up for decades. $100 became $200 when I got promoted to lead mechanic in 1994. We added a little more whenever there was a bonus, a tax refund, an inheritance from Dolores's aunt in 2003. We never touched it. Never bragged about it. Never even discussed it much with Beth, because by the time she was old enough to understand what a brokerage statement was, it had just become part of the furniture of our marriage, something we tended quietly the way I tended the tomatoes. The company split its stock twice over the years, got acquired by a larger industrial firm in 2011, and the shares converted accordingly. I kept every statement in a battered gray filing box in the hall closet, next to Dolores's old sewing machine. After Dolores died, I kept contributing on my own, smaller amounts now that I was retired, mostly just letting it sit and compound. I didn't think of it as a secret, exactly. It just never came up, and nobody ever asked me a real question about my finances. They asked me about the Buick. They asked if I needed help with my thermostat. Nobody asked what was in the gray box in the closet. In the spring of that year, the parent company that had acquired Carl's old employer back in 2011 announced it was being bought out by a much larger conglomerate, in a deal that valued shares far above where they'd been trading. My modest account, built dollar by dollar since Reagan was president, was suddenly worth considerably more than modest. Patricia Alvarez, the estate attorney I'd used years earlier to help settle Dolores's aunt's affairs, and who I'd kept on to manage the trust paperwork tied to the account, called to walk me through the final numbers once the buyout closed and the shares settled. I remember standing in my kitchen, phone against my ear, looking at the same chipped mug on the counter, while she read me the total. "Walter, I want to make sure this lands correctly," she said. "After the buyout premium and the final share conversion, the account is valued at $2,311,000. I didn't say anything for a second. Scout was asleep on the kitchen tile, one ear twitching. "Say that number again," I told her, and she did, slower, like she understood exactly why I needed to hear it twice. I want to be honest with you. I didn't feel triumphant in that moment. I felt something closer to grief, actually, because the first thought in my head was that Dolores wasn't there to hear it with me. She'd been the one who first said, half joking, "Let's just pretend this money doesn't exist, Walter, and see what happens in 30 years. We pretended for 36. I asked Patricia what came next, procedurally, and she said she'd prepare documentation for the trust, and since Beth was named as a secondary beneficiary on the account structure we'd set up years back, it made sense to schedule a meeting where I could walk my daughter through what existed and what my wishes were for it. I agreed. I didn't plan to make a show of it. I'm not built that way. But I also didn't see the point in hiding something Beth had a right to eventually understand, especially with Lily's future in the picture. I want to spend a moment on that gray filing box, because I think it explains more about me than the number ever could. It sat on the top shelf of the hall closet, behind a stack of old towels, and it held 36 years of quarterly statements, a handwritten ledger Dolores kept for the first decade before the brokerage went digital, and a single yellowed newspaper clipping about the industrial firm's original public offering that Carl Pruitt had clipped and given me back in 1988 with a note that just said, "Worth a look, Walt." I used to take that box down maybe once a year, usually in January, and go through it slowly with a cup of coffee, not because I needed to check anything. Patricia's office had copies of everything current, but because it was, in a strange way, a record of a marriage as much as a record of money. Every entry was a decision Dolores and I had made together at that kitchen table, usually after the kids were in bed, usually over the same legal pad, refilled a dozen times over the years. There's a kind of quiet competence that never announces itself, that just keeps showing up in the same unglamorous way, year after year, long after anyone's watching. I think that's the real hidden thing in this story. Not the dollar figure. The discipline underneath it, and the woman I built it with. I asked for 2 weeks before that meeting happened. Partly logistics. Mostly, if I'm honest, because Thanksgiving fell in that window, and some part of me wanted to see, one more time, what the family looked like without the knowledge sitting in the room. I'm not proud of that curiosity, but I don't regret it either. It told me something true about where I stood that I might never have learned otherwise. The meeting with Patricia happened on a Tuesday afternoon, 10 days after Thanksgiving, in her office on Front Street. A plain, unglamorous suite above a dry cleaner, nothing like the polished downtown high-rise where Derek worked. I asked Beth to come. I did not invite Derek, but Beth, without telling me beforehand, brought him anyway, saying afterward that she felt he should hear it directly rather than secondhand, given how the Thanksgiving conversation had gone. I understood her reasoning, even if I hadn't planned for it. Patricia was in her mid-50s, silver-streaked hair pulled back, reading glasses pushed up on her head more often than on her nose. She didn't perform for anybody. Her office had a single-framed law degree on the wall and a philodendron that had clearly outlived several attempts to keep it trimmed. She laid 3 folders on the table. The original 1988 account opening documents, the annual statements going back decades, and the final settlement letter from the buyout. And she went through them the way you'd walk someone through a set of blueprints. No drama. Just facts, laid flat on a table, one after another. She didn't look at Derek once while she spoke, and she didn't look at me for approval either. She simply presented what was true and let the room absorb it at its own pace. I noticed that and appreciated it. There's a particular kind of credibility that comes from someone who has nothing riding on which way you react. This account, she said, tapping the oldest folder, was opened by Walter and Dolores Higgins in June of 1988 with an initial deposit of $400, followed by consistent monthly contributions for the following 36 years. She flipped to a summary page. Following the acquisition finalized last month, the account's current value stands at $2,311,000. Beth put her hand over her mouth. Derek leaned forward and actually reached for the folder, turning statement pages like he was checking for a typo. These are real? He asked. This whole time? These are the original custodial records, Patricia said evenly. I'd be glad to walk you through the specific holdings and the acquisition terms if that would help. Derek looked at me. I watched something move across his face. Not anger this time. Something closer to the specific embarrassment of realizing you've spent years confidently wrong about a person. Walter, I had no idea, he said. His voice had none of its usual polish in it. I know, I said. That was sort of the point of not mentioning it. I want to pause here and say something plainly, because I think it matters more than the number itself. I didn't build that account to prove Derek wrong someday. Dolores and I built it because we believed in quiet, boring persistence, the same belief that got me through 38 years of engine repair. You do the small correct thing consistently, and you let time do the rest of the work. The fact that it also happened to answer every smug comment Derek ever made was, in a strange way, beside the point. But I won't pretend it didn't feel like something settling into place when Patricia read that number out loud in front of him. What happened after that meeting is really the part of this story worth telling, because plenty of people can find satisfaction in a moment like that and stop there. I didn't want to stop there. A number on a page doesn't repair 11 years of small cuts, and I wasn't interested in simply trading places with Derek, becoming the one who got to look down on someone else for a change. Derek called me 2 days after the meeting and asked if he could come by the house alone, without Beth. I said yes. He showed up on a Thursday evening, still in his work clothes, and stood in my kitchen looking noticeably smaller than I'd ever seen him look at a dinner table. I've been trying to figure out how to say this, he said. I was a jerk to you. Repeatedly. And it wasn't really about you. I figured that much, I said. What was it about? He was quiet for a second, turning a coaster over in his hands. My dad lost his business when I was 14. We went from a nice house to a 2-bedroom apartment in about 6 months, and people who used to be friendly with my parents just disappeared. I grew up thinking money was the only thing that kept people from disappearing on you. So somewhere along the way, I started measuring everybody by it. I guess to make sure I wasn't going to end up disappeared on again. That's not an excuse, I said. I know, he said quickly. I'm not saying it's an excuse. I'm saying it's the closest thing I've got to an explanation, and I owe you an actual one instead of just an apology I don't back up with anything. I appreciated that he drew that line himself. I've found that people who say that's not an excuse, and then genuinely mean it are rarer than you'd think, and worth taking seriously when you find one. I told him I wasn't interested in him groveling, and I wasn't interested in pretending the last several years hadn't happened either. I told him if he wanted things to be different, it would show up in small, ordinary moments, the same way that disrespect had, not in one big dramatic gesture. He asked, a little hesitantly, whether I planned to help with Lily's future, school, and so on, now that things had changed. I told him the trust already accounted for Lily's education, that this had been true since before the buyout and had nothing to do with anything he'd said at any dinner table, and that I'd appreciate it if we didn't let money become the entire language of our relationship going forward, since that had been most of the trouble to begin with. He nodded like that landed somewhere real. The months after that were not a movie montage. I want to be honest about the slowness of it, because I think that's the truer story. Derek didn't become a different man overnight, and I didn't magically stop noticing the old habits in him. In January, he made an offhand comment at a family dinner about a client's smart investment strategy, and I watched him catch himself mid-sentence, glance at me, and visibly redirect the conversation somewhere else. Small thing. I noticed it anyway. In February, he came by on a Saturday, uninvited but welcome, and spent 3 hours helping me repair a section of fence in the backyard that had been leaning for 2 years. We didn't talk about money once. We talked about the Bruins, mostly, and Scout, who supervised the entire project from the porch with what I can only describe as professional skepticism. In March, Beth told me Derek had started seeing a counselor on his own, without her prompting him. I didn't ask for details. That wasn't mine to ask for. I just noted it, the way you note a gauge finally reading normal after a long stretch of running hot. In April, there was a setback, small but worth mentioning, because I don't think this kind of change moves in a straight line. Derek made a comment at a birthday dinner for Manny Ferreira's granddaughter, a family we'd become close with over the years, joking about old folks and their coupon habits in a way that landed a little too close to his old register. I didn't say anything at the table, but afterward, in the parking lot, I told him plainly that the joke had an old taste to it, and that I wasn't going to pretend I hadn't noticed. He didn't argue. He just said, "You're right. That one slipped out. I'm sorry," and left it there, without turning it into a longer conversation about his intentions. I respected that more than a longer apology would have earned. Some corrections don't need an essay attached to them. In May, Derek asked if he could take Lily and me to a Red Sox game. Just the three of us, no particular occasion attached to it. We sat in the bleachers, ate overpriced hot dogs, and Lily fell asleep against my shoulder in the 7th inning while the Sox blew a 2-run lead in typical fashion. Derek drove us home afterward and, in the quiet of the car with Lily asleep in the back seat, said, "I keep thinking about how long I had this wrong. I'm not trying to make you say it's fine. I just want you to know I think about it." I told him that noticing was worth more than he probably realized, and that he didn't need my forgiveness delivered in a single sentence to know he was headed somewhere better. Some things earn their way back and slowly, the same way they were lost slowly, one comment at a time in reverse. There was a boundary I held during all of this, and I want to mention it because I think people sometimes assume forgiveness means erasing the line entirely. It doesn't. When Derek, in a moment of genuine goodwill, suggested I let him manage some of the trust professionally, I said no, clearly and without apology. Patricia continued handling it. I told him the offer meant something to me, but that I needed a boundary there for a while, maybe a long while, and that this wasn't a punishment so much as an honest account of where trust currently stood between us. He didn't push. That, more than almost anything else, told me the apology in my kitchen back in December had been real. The symbolic moment, if you want to call it that, came in late June. Dolores had owned a small wind-up carriage clock, a wedding gift from her mother, that Derek had once described, years earlier, at some family gathering, as a nice little antique, in a tone that made clear he considered it worthless. The clock had stopped running around the time Dolores passed, and I'd left it silent on the mantel ever since, unable to bring myself to fix it or throw it out. Derek asked, quietly, one afternoon in June, if he could take it to a clockmaker he knew through a client. No charge, just as something he wanted to do. I said yes. 3 weeks later, he brought it back, cleaned and running, the small ticking sound filling my living room again for the first time in 4 years. He didn't make a speech about it. He just set it on the mantel, wound it, and said, "I should have asked about this a long time ago instead of talking about it." I keep it wound now. It's a small sound, easy to miss if you're not listening for it. But I hear it every evening, and it means something different to me now than it did when Dolores was alive to hear it with me. Not less, just different. In September, something happened that I didn't expect and couldn't have planned for. Derek asked me, almost sheepishly, if I'd be willing to teach him how the old brokerage account had actually worked, not to manage it, he was careful to say, just to understand it, since in 11 years of talking about markets professionally, he'd never once asked me a genuine question about how Dolores and I had built anything ourselves. We sat at my kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon, the same table where Dolores and I had made every decision in that gray box, and I walked him through the old ledger, the handwritten entries, the 2 stock splits, the acquisition in 2011. He didn't say much. Mostly he just listened, turning pages slowly, the way you'd handle something you'd finally been given permission to take seriously. Near the end, he said, "This is the most unglamorous path to real money I've ever actually seen documented. Everyone I work with wants the exciting version." I told him the exciting version was usually the expensive one, and he laughed, a real laugh this time, nothing performative in it. By October, the two of us had settled into something I'd call an easy truce. Not quite the closeness I imagined for a son-in-law when Beth first brought him home 11 years earlier, but honest, and improving in small increments I'd stopped expecting. He still occasionally slipped back into old habits. A comment here, a tone there, but he caught himself faster each time, and caught himself without needing me to point it out, which mattered more to me than a perfect record ever could have. By that Thanksgiving, a full year after the one where all of this started, the table looked much the same. Same house, same mismatched chairs pulled in from the kitchen, same two small tablecloth Beth had had since her first apartment. Derek said grace that year, which he'd never done before, and thanked me by name for the meal and for still being patient with all of us, which was as close as he'd come to naming what had happened without turning it into a performance. Lily, 8 now, sat next to me and asked if Scout could have a piece of turkey, which I allowed, against doctor's orders for both of us. I think about Dolores often when I wind that little carriage clock now, and about the legal pad we filled up a dozen times over at that kitchen table for $100 a month at a time, never once imagining it would end up meaning anything beyond the two of us and whatever quiet retirement we were quietly building toward. I don't think either of us set out to prove a point to anybody. We just believed that steady, unglamorous effort was worth more than it looked like in the moment, and I've come to believe that's true of people, too, not just money. Derek looked at me for years and saw only what was easy to see: an old man, a modest pension, a car with chalky paint on the hood, because that's the version of me that required nothing further from him. It took a folder of decades-old statements to make him actually look. If there's a single thing I've taken from all of this, it's this: how a person treats you when they think you have nothing to offer them tells you more about their character than almost anything else they'll ever say. And how you respond to that treatment, quietly, without needing an audience, without needing to win in the room where you were wronged, says just as much about yours. If this story reminded you of someone at your own table, or a moment you sat through in silence because you knew something they didn't, I'd like to hear about it. Tell me in the comments. And if you think somebody else needs to hear this one, go ahead and share it with them.